So, the topic of reparations in America has sparked debate for many decades now, and there have been many who have tried to form a case against reparations. But I think the best to do so is Richard A. Epstein with his article published by the Chicago Law School in 2004 titled The Case Against Black Reparations. In my opinion, this article best presents a set of arguments on the subject that are substantive, genuine, and respectful of the achievements made by the civil rights movement. Epstein lays out a whole litany of reasons, both legal and political, that reparations are problematic and realistically untenable. But in this video, I'm going to attempt to expand on the more political side of the argument, the political ramifications of black reparations. I'm going to analyze the argument Epstein makes, its strengths and its weaknesses. So, like I said a bit earlier, Epstein's article primarily addresses the issue in two sections: the legal obstacles to implementing reparations, like statute of limitations, the political question doctrine, and the standing of the reparations themselves legally. And then there's the second section, the politically focused one, that argues that even outside the courtroom, as a purely practical matter, reparations are untenable. They're not very likely to win the public support. Epstein takes into account the original unifying successes of the civil rights movement in its prime, the 1960s, and questions whether the institution of reparations will actually achieve justice or deepen racial divisions and undo a lot of the successes and the goodwill built up by the civil rights movement. In the conclusion of his article, Epstein aptly points out that, quote, a divisive campaign for reparations will undercut the efforts that we all want to make a stronger, more vital, more productive, and more caring nation, end quote, basically underlining that the strong unifying civil rights goal that is necessary for effecting government change and that allowed the movement to be so successful in the 60s is now undermined by the campaigns for black reparations. The civil rights movement succeeded initially because it unified people under a single goal, and supporters of black reparations have subsequently tried to recreate this unity and public support in order to effect reparations, but they ultimately have been unsuccessful. They've been unsuccessful because they failed to address modern grievances among society, which is what the civil rights movement originally did so well. Instead, the black reparations movement feels too focused on past injustices, and thus the strategy will fail because it's ineffective at unifying people and sowing good racial relations within the country. So what I'm going to do now is show a broken down and reconstructed kind of visualization of this argument in a premise to conclusion form. And I'll take a look at if Epstein decides to make a deductive or inductive argument, depending on how the conclusion follows from the premises. I'll also discuss the argument's strengths and weaknesses, and whether the argument is valid or invalid. So, starting with premise 1. The civil rights movement originally unified Americans by addressing immediate, observable injustices like segregation and voting rights. Premise 2. After the success of the civil rights movement, there was a lack of a clear unifying cause, leading to fragmented goals, such as affirmative action. Premise 3. Reparations for slavery seek to revive the unity of the civil rights movement by returning to a shared moral struggle. Premise 4. However, reparations focus on historical wrongs, not present-day injustices, and are unlikely to unify the public. In the conclusion, therefore, the push for reparations is politically counterproductive and risks creating more division than progress. So, when looking at the first two premises, we can already tell that Epstein is mostly laying the grounds for a good argument. In his article, Epstein talks about the civil rights movement, saying, quote, its great accomplishment was to make sure that all individuals had equal rights and liberties under the law. That is a result that can be applauded by people of all political persuasions, end quote. Reaffirming the first premise that the civil rights movement was originally unified by Americans addressing immediate observable injustices. In its height, the civil rights movement was achieving the success that it was achieving because it was addressing obvious and observable issues at the time, such as Jim Crow and segregation. The movement was calling for very common sense changes in society, and these common sense, publicly supported goals were what enabled actual change to happen on the government level, such as the Civil Rights Act in 1964. After the 1960s, however, the success of the civil rights movement basically ended with it having no unifying goal to pursue anymore. With the end of segregation, that's basically what happened. They had no longer had a central goal to unify people under. So from that, we can determine that the first two premises are strong premises. And then the third premise is also very strong, but is not as strong as the first two because it's a little more subjective. Basically, Epstein, in his premise, kind of assumes that all advocates for reparations are advocating for reparations on symbolic grounds, and they're seeking to reinvigorate the shared moral struggles of the civil rights movement. But this doesn't really take into account that many reparations advocates are genuinely looking at it as a purely practical matter and a less symbolic matter. They think that it actually has practical modern day effects in terms of people's wealth. And then we get to the fourth premise that seems to be the most subjective and therefore the weakest of the premises. The premise assumes that reparations are only proposed in order to address historical wrongs. And while reparations do, in fact, address historical wrongs, it's not always the case that they are irrelevant to modern day injustices. Many would use modern instances of police brutality and large scale incarceration amongst black communities to argue that systemic injustices and repression of black Americans is still prevalent today, and that these reparations are a way of addressing these contemporary problems that come from long lasting effects of segregation and slavery. Also, Epstein's sentiment that the reparations will only divide Americans rather than unify them is somewhat speculative and maybe too broad of an assumption, because while politically controversial, there have been times where countries and the people within those countries have had serious and productive dialogue about reparations. They've had proposals that have brought more awareness to matters of race, history, and justice. Germany's Holocaust reparations are an example that restorative justice and national healing are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist. Also, Epstein's article is lacking in empirical and historical evidence to support some of the premises, specifically the premise that the civil rights movement was solely centered around segregation and voting rights. Instead, Epstein takes a more interpretive approach, looking at the relative lack of recent strides made by the civil rights movement as evidence that the movement's goals are no longer as unifying and as ascertainable as the original goals. Epstein also could have addressed the fate of the civil rights leaders like MLK and RFK, and how the lasting legacy of the civil rights movement was stymied in large part by assassination, state repression, and incarceration. So because of these instances, some of Epstein's claims may not be addressing every side of the argument. Notable writer Ta-Nehisi Coates published a famous article in The Atlantic in 2014 titled "The Case for Reparations." In the article, Coates brings forth many historical anecdotes of black oppression in America and argues that anecdotes like these and their effects far outweigh any criticisms from those who are against reparations. He writes, "Broach the topic of reparations today and a barrage of questions inevitably follows. Who will be paid? How much will they be paid? Who will pay? But if the practicalities, not the justice of reparations, are the true sticking point, there has for some time been the beginnings of a solution." Making the point that the issue should not be so quickly dismissed on the basis of logistics. There are many methods of implementation that have been devised by reparations advocates over the decades, as it has remained an important issue for many. But too many times the issue is dismissed by people who somewhat disingenuously ask these logistical questions. Furthermore, this large-scale focus on only logistics points to an unfortunate large-scale lack of enthusiasm for justice for black Americans. Epstein's article as a whole is valid and has strong internal logic. He presents several strong premises about the implications of reparations and uses them to support the broader conclusion that reparations are untenable, which means that Epstein is making an inductive argument. Furthermore, the logical progression of the premises to the conclusion leads to the argument, for the most part, being cogent. His argument does appear questionable at times because of the assumptions he makes about the motives of black reparations advocates, as well as the lack of evidence he provides sometimes to specifically support his claims. and the premises, while not backed up completely by evidence, are still strong enough to make this a sound argument. A stronger argument would have provided more to back up its premises, and a more developed understanding of the argument might recognize that reparations, while addressing the past, also seek to create a future with more equity. All in all, I think the article adequately and maturely addresses the conversation around reparations. It uses mostly strong premises to make a multifaceted argument. Most importantly, in my opinion, it makes a good faith argument that optimistically seeks to unify the country and preserve the goals and successes of the American civil rights movement.